This is Journey to Chinese Fluency Podcast, episode number 20.
Embarrassing moment, culture insights, proven methods to achieve Chinese fluency. Skip that learning curve with the Journey to Chinese Fluency Podcast. Now, your host, Victor Yang.
Hello everyone, Victor Yang here and welcome to Journey to Chinese Fluency. Today I am joined by Richard Doran. Richard is from Dublin, Ireland, born in 1976. His native language is English with a bit of Irish. Richard lived in China from 1998 to 2013. Since then, have been back several times a year for work as an educational consultant. And here's one interesting fact about Richard. He went to China as a bat and ended up living in China for 16 years. 你好, Richard. Welcome to the show.
你好啊，你好，欢迎。
Are you ready to share with us your journey to Chinese fluency?
You bet.
Awesome. So let's do this. So first of all, please feel free to fill in the blank a bit for the introduction.
Hello, my name is Richard. I was born 1976 from Dublin, Ireland. I've lived in China for 16 years, and I hope that some of my disasters and high life points, I don't even know if that's a word, in China will be of use to anybody learning Chinese or wanting to know more about what it's like to live in China.
Great. So your interesting fact is very interesting. Your interesting fact is you went to China as a bat. So can you tell us a bit more about that? What happened?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to just remind everybody, don't go to any country you know nothing about if it's on a bet. It never really works out. Basically, what happened, I was traveling around Australia in 97, and I happened to be staying at a hostel in Sydney, Australia. And the owner of the hostel gave me an opportunity to teach English in Beijing and also in the northeast of China in Liaoning province in Liaoyang. And along with two friends from the UK, I said, sure, that sounds fun, easy. And basically, he asked us on a Thursday, and I think by the following Thursday or Friday, we were actually standing in the classroom in Beijing.
Wow.
And it was a very strange experience because we went from the beautiful Australian summer into the depths of a Chinese, a northeastern Chinese winter. And that was quite a shock. Talk about culture shock. It was freezing.
Wow. What made you to make that decision to go to China?
Well, basically, I didn't really have anything going on at the time. I just finished college in Dublin. I just graduated and I was kind of working my way around Australia, although I didn't get very far. I think I got as far as the Gold Coast. And Melbourne, actually. It was in Melbourne for a little bit. And this opportunity came along, and I thought, well, why not go check out a new country? And it could be an interesting story. I probably didn't do enough research because I think if I had looked into just how difficult it was going to be, I might have talked myself out of the opportunity. But sometimes it's best to dive headfirst into these opportunities and just, you know, kind of take life as it comes, really, rather than psyching yourself out and saying, oh, no, I couldn't do that. That's not responsible. It pays to be irresponsible, kids. Sometimes.
Wow, you're a brave man.
Thank you.
So, please share with our listeners why you learn Chinese. Well, obviously, you went to China and you have to learn Chinese, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is there any other particular reasons?
Well, I mean, learning a language of the country you're being in is also a great bargaining tool. And it just makes it easier because being able to understand not only what people are saying, but also the nuances of the language. It really does make it easier to integrate into the country and to kind of deepen friendships that you might have with your colleagues and people you meet while traveling. It also gives you the sense of confidence that you need for navigating China because it's such a vast country and, you know, it can be quite difficult to get around, literally. So being able to speak the language, ask questions, and you don't even have to be good. That's one thing I would emphasize. It's not a case of becoming fluent. It's a case of becoming competent, being able to speak. And, you know, when people in China, I've noticed, see you're making an effort, they tend to be more accommodating and they will help you as much as possible, which is invaluable if you plan on traveling around the country.
Right. So once you arrived in Beijing, did you just go straight to a Chinese classroom to learn Chinese?
No, what happened was in 1998, when I actually arrived in China, I spent the first year teaching English in Liaoning province in Liaoyang, which is a relatively small city.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has a population of 180,000, which as someone from Ireland is quite a large city, but in Chinese terms, it's relatively small. So I was teaching English in a primary school there for about a year. And during the time I was there, I just really enjoyed it, first of all. And I said that it would be great to come back. So I was offered a second contract to return in the summertime. And I thought, well, I've been here during the winter, so I'll definitely come back in the summer when it's nice and warm and I won't have to worry about being cold. I came back in the middle of the summer and it went from minus 15 degrees to plus 29. And eventually going up as high as 40.
Wow.
So I thought, this is crazy. When is it normal weather? But I really liked it. The second time I arrived in China, I was in Shenyang, which is the provincial capital of Liaoning province. And then later on, about 4 or 5 months later, I moved to Beijing. I was still teaching at the time, but I started to take classes at a university in the suburbs of Beijing. And then much later, after returning to Ireland for about a year, I returned to China for the third time as a full-time student and enrolled for 3 years at BLCU, which is the Beijing Language and Cultural University in Beijing, Haidian District.
Right, so that's how you started learning Chinese.
Yes, I suppose officially that's how I started learning Chinese, because up until then I was just self-taught. I just had some books and some friends were, giving me books to read on how to teach yourself Chinese and stuff like that. So I suppose if I was to gain any advice, or if I have gained any advice or any experience from that, it would be don't be afraid of putting in the hours and learning the language, because it really will help you in the long run.
Yeah, definitely putting yourself into the environment and not just mingling with English-speaking people, but rather mingling with the native Chinese will definitely help you to learn Chinese.
For sure. I think it's actually easier to do that the further away from a big city you go. I wonder, would my story be the same if I stayed in Beijing for the first year or so? Because Beijing, as you know, is a multicultural, a fairly multicultural city, very international city, just like many other cities like Shanghai or Guangzhou or places like that, where there is the opportunity to never speak Chinese and to live quite well. There's so many large expat communities, so you could get away with never actually speaking the language, which would be a shame if you spent that much time there and not being able to speak it.
That's very true. So now please share with us your journey of learning Chinese. What's been the most effective technique or method that's been working for you?
I suppose the most effective technique, if you want to call it that, is just really going through a book. And I remember, there's like 800 sentences, I think it's called. 汉语八百句.
Right.
It was a book like that. And it was like basically the kind of things you can imagine like an English learner would use. It's like, what to say when you go to McDonald's, or now here's the post office. You need to send a letter. And it'd be dialogue-based teaching. So it would be, you're in the post office. How do you buy a stamp, or how do you send a letter international? That kind of thing. So that was the very first introduction I had to learning the language. But afterwards, I found a method that worked for me, and it was basically using English to learn Chinese. So what I'd do is I'd think through a task that I needed to do that day. For example, maybe I needed to buy a present for a friend's birthday. So I'd think, okay, well, I'm going to need to know how to ask for a section in a shopping center where they sell suitable presents. So like, where is the 什么什么地方在哪里? So I'd think, okay, I don't know how to say that in Chinese. So I'd write down in English the phrase I was trying to learn, and then basically go through either a dictionary or ask a friend, how do I say this phrase? And that's how I would learn what I considered useful Chinese, because it was all based on real experiences. And then later on, I would just keep a notebook with me at all times and write down any new word or phrase, that came along that I thought, oh, that's going to be useful. And this notebook became my first, I suppose, textbook, really. And I used it to get me through some very tricky times where I could learn like useful phrases based on real experiences, and then just make a note of them. And then at the end of the week, I'd try and review all of these phrases and see how many I could remember. And, after a while, it kind of started to stick.
Right.
So that was my method.
Right. So while you were learning Chinese, so you basically built up your sentence vocabulary, right? Like you learn all the sentences from this book called 汉语800句, which is Mandarin 800 sentences.
That's it, yeah.
So apart from that, you also accumulate English sentences and then you translate that into Chinese and then you learn those.
Yes, exactly.
Did you get help from your Chinese friends to help you like translating those sentences?
Yeah, I did. Actually, I should say before I got the actual book, the first book that I just mentioned, a colleague of mine was helping me write down the phrases that I needed. And using those phrases, I was able to learn the basics of Chinese. And then later on, I went to Shenyang, where there was a foreign language bookshop, and I got some books myself and used that to kind of help me to learn more about grammar and writing characters.
Right.
I remember when I first started, actually, I made a big mistake when I was learning. Because the book I had, halfway through it, it changes into characters. So up until then, it's just using 汉语拼音.
Yeah, pinyin.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like phonics. So that was fine. But then after halfway through, it's all Chinese characters and I couldn't understand it. So I had to go back to the beginning of the book and start all over again.
Oh.
And relearn the phrases that I had started with. But it was okay. It was tricky. But I'm talking now about learning the writing. I think Chinese characters, especially for Europeans, are probably one of the biggest challenges that you will have. But it's just one of those things you kind of have to deal with. One piece of advice I would give is when you are going to learn Chinese characters, one thing I would think about is don't overthink it. And that means like, don't say to yourself, oh, this is impossible. Or even ask too many questions. Like, why do we write them like this? Certainly for the first month or so, just take everything on board and say, okay, so that's how you write the character. Later on, you will notice patterns arriving and you will see that it starts to make more sense. So rather than overthink it and try to overanalyze something and make it quite difficult for yourself, just like take it on board and then later on, you will finally notice a logical pattern to it.
So while you were learning Chinese, was there a particular method you use? For example, do you use flashcards or do you use repetition? What kind of methods do you use to memorize those Chinese characters or just the Chinese phrases?
I don't think I had flashcards, no. I think basically I wrote a lot. So I'd write down every phrase or word that I came across and just go back over my notes. Sometimes I think I maybe had children's cards, which were kind of like flashcards. They had like a picture and then the word was on the same side. And I would just basically try and look at the picture and remind myself, oh, what is the word here? I like if it's right. Like, I remember once one word, like say mature, like there'd be a picture of a mature, like a horse and cart. And I'd try and remember, how do you say that in Chinese? This is before I could write the character. So it's just a question of that, really, just going to go back and forth. But one thing that I do remember, when I was learning Chinese, I never really saw it as a task. I never saw it as like a chore. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed trying to challenge myself to remember as many words as I could during the week. Because, obviously, if you're living in the language environment of the language you're trying to pick up, it's obviously a lot easier. So what I would do is I'd get about maybe 15, 20 words by the end of the week, and I'd see how many of the words could I remember. And then I'd look at the previous week and see how many could I remember and just see what my retention skill was. So sometimes I'd learn maybe 40 words, but I'd only remember maybe half. And then other times it would be easier. I'd remember most of them. So, obviously as time went on, this got easier. But for the beginning, though, that's kind of the way it worked. My attitude was I enjoy the process, so I never really saw it as I have to learn this language. I wanted to learn, and because I wanted to learn, that definitely made it easier,
Yeah.
Wanting to do something as opposed to being told you have to do something. Two very different approaches. And that's why, as an English teacher, for example, when I'm asked by parents of students, how can my kid learn English quickly? Well, I say, well, you have to change the attitude. You can't approach it like, I have to do this, otherwise, something bad will happen. You need to approach it like, oh, this could be fun. Like, let's make it interesting. And then you'll find you'll reward yourself for your progress, and you won't be too hard on yourself if, because, like any language, it's going to get difficult the more you go on. But if you kind of adopt the attitude of, hey, this is kind of fun, this is crazy, how difficult this is. But if you're still able to laugh about it and say, don't worry about it, you'll get it. Because you'll always find there'll be somebody better than you, and there'll always be somebody worse than you, and you'll become a person's teacher. And remember that. So never give yourself the pressure of, I'm never getting this, because if you look back at your notes from when you first started, you'll see you've already made terrific progress. And if things get tough, take a break, come back to it later. Just, think of it as like the same way you listen to music. I used to listen to a lot of pop music as well, learning Chinese that way, and obviously the TV, or even the cassette tapes that you used to get when you bought books, teach yourself Chinese. I just leave them on in the background, almost like background noise.
Right. Wow.
And then, you're creating this environment. So your brain is taking in more than you actually realize. And then eventually you go, oh, you know what? I can actually remember some of this. Or at the very least, what you'll find is that it's not as strange as you thought it was, or there is a kind of a logic there. So that's something you'll definitely notice after a relatively small amount of time.
So how did you learn listening and speaking? So you mentioned you were reading and writing. You just practice that a lot. So in terms of speaking and listening, for example, also the pronunciation, how did you practice those?
Well, speaking, obviously living in the country of the language I'm learning, I just, basically just could speak to everybody and practice that way. But I suppose one of the things that I tried to do was force myself to speak to people, asking questions, and just seeing, if people could help me, and just practicing and paying attention to their reaction. So, just to see, like, am I saying this right, or is there a better way of doing this, whatever. And just eventually, it gets easier. And then it's difficult to really put a finger on it, like, in terms of how I spoke. It was just making the effort to go out there and communicate with people, not being afraid of making mistakes. Sometimes, or certainly when I was learning Chinese, people would sometimes laugh if you get their pronunciation wrong. And that could be a little bit tough. After a while, though, you just kind of say, well, look, it doesn't matter. Just, like, keep speaking. Don't take it to heart. And in terms of, like, oh, they're going to laugh at me if I get it wrong, just kind of try speaking. And then just try and make note as much as possible where you're making mistakes, how you can make it better. And asking questions, especially with your friends, you can say, oh, how should I say this? Or what's the correct pronunciation? I also recorded people as well.
Right.
With their permission. I'd have them read a passage for me.
Right.
Like, say, from like a textbook if I was reading, or something like that. I'd say, can you read this for me so I can kind of practice by listening to you?
Cool.
So it was just like that, basically.
Just speak up.
Exactly, yeah. Just speak up.
Right.
That's it, really. I mean, there's no kind of like real trick to it. The only thing is, like, the difference, I suppose, learning on your own as opposed to learning in country, if you like, is obviously learning in country, it's easier because you've got more opportunities to hear and also speak to somebody. If you're learning outside of the country, what I would suggest is just basically playing tapes, CDs, there's podcasts out there that you can use to help you with your pronunciation. And just create this language environment by having Chinese on all the time. And then gradually your ears get tuned to it, just like you're learning a musical instrument, really. And then just, as I say, make notes as much as you can. And the notes don't even have to be that detailed. It's just like certain words. One thing that's really useful is using a thesaurus. So when you're learning one word, you're actually getting a few words at the same time where, it's showing you, oh, with this word goes with this word, or, whatever. So it's useful that way. So just kind of get stuck in there.
So what have been your biggest challenge in learning Chinese, and how did you overcome it?
Well, to be honest, I don't know what I could say is my biggest challenge. I mean, Chinese is a language that the longer you learn, the harder it seems to get. There's an expression in Chinese which is 活到老学到老, which means to, as long as you're alive, you'll always keep learning. But I changed it to 活到老学不了. It's like as soon as you believe you've cracked Chinese, somebody will come along and say, well, actually, there's this other grammar rule that we didn't tell you about. It's almost like people are watching you. Wait until you get to a certain level, and then they say, yeah, actually, that doesn't work in this case. It's different.
That's a funny quote.
So, yeah, well, the attitude, I think, is just like, as I said to you, you'll always find people who can speak better. Try not to compare yourself to others. Compare yourself to yourself. Like, so look at the progress you've made over the last period of time, however long that might be. And, literally point out what you can do now that you couldn't do. And set yourself manageable goals like, I want to be able to read a newspaper in Chinese, or I want to be able to buy a bus ticket or a plane ticket in Chinese. So, I need to get to a certain level. And then eventually you're able to do that and you go, great, what's the next challenge? So
yeah,
it's just you set up a goal for yourself and try and stick to it, but make the goal manageable. Like, you don't want to say, okay, in 1 year, I want to perform crosstalk on national television in front of a live studio audience. Well, that's kind of ridiculous because it's extremely difficult. But why not say, I want to write a letter?
Yeah.
I want to tell my girlfriend what I really think of her in Chinese.
Yeah. Cool. Great advice. So did you have to deal with any accent or dialects while you were in China?
Yeah, well, I was in the Northeast, as I said, for the first year or so. So there's obviously the Northeast of China. That's the northern dialect. And yeah, that was a bit tricky. But actually, I thought it was the other way around. When I was in the Northeast of China and, getting that dialect down, if you like, I found that when I got to Beijing, I was thinking, oh, my goodness, how can they sound so quite different? The Beijing accent is so much stronger. Yes. So it's just that, really. It's just like the dialect. And then, of course, later on, traveling around, going to the south of China, and you would find it's like a completely different language altogether.
Yeah.
So that was really, really hard. But eventually, it just kind of it was like, well, I'm never going to actually remember this. So forget it. Don't worry about it. I'll just pick up what I can. And I'll speak Mandarin better.
Right.
So hopefully they can understand that.
I see. So you kind of try to avoid learning all those dialects and just try to improve your Mandarin.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, if you think about the dialects, right, you look at, say, Chinese people, right, if they're learning other dialects too, it's going to take them a lifetime to really to get to the level that's good to speak the dialect. And also, I think, the whole point in having a single language really is to make it easier for people to communicate. So learn Mandarin Chinese as best you can and make that your standard dialect, if you like. And then you'll find that communicating with anybody is so much easier.
Sure. So if you were to start learning Chinese from scratch all over again, how would you do it?
Oh God, that sounds like a nightmare. I don't know, actually. I think it's quite different when you have, there's different points in your life when you can learn a new language, and it's like sometimes, like when you're younger, I suppose, and you don't think about it so much, you can learn a language quite quickly. And when you have the motivation as well, obviously you can learn a language quite quickly. One thing I would definitely do again is I'd probably speak even more than I did before. And I would set myself realistic goals. Although I have to say, I never really set myself crazy goals. Like a lot of what happened to me in terms of working on television and in the media, that came just through chance opportunities. So it was never a question of I should make some contacts in a TV station and use that as my motivation for speaking the language. So I would probably do a lot of the same thing. I'd probably go maybe to a smaller city, avoid the bigger cities. It's more difficult now, I think, than before because, as I said before, big cities have their conveniences and their disadvantages, So I don't know if I would say don't go to a big city, but I mean, if you're serious about learning a language, I would certainly consider it. If you really do want to learn the language, why not go to a smaller city? It's cheaper for a start. You could get into a good Chinese program and you'll get more chances to speak. And then later on, when you go to a big city to work for whatever reason, you'll find it a lot easier, I think, I think it's a lot to do with your attitude as well, so it's a lot to do with your attitude, really. Sometimes it can be challenging for people. learning a language, because of whatever reason, where they are, their level of motivation. But if you're clear about the reasons for wanting to learn the language too, that will also pay off in the end. Like if you're saying, I'm doing this just for work, then there's a certain level of Chinese you need to get to. And then it's quite achievable to do that. If you're saying, I'm just doing it because I think Chinese is an important language and will continue to be an important language for many years to come, so that's why I want to give myself all the advantages I can, then there's no pressure whatsoever, because anything you can say will be an advantage. It's there's a great feeling of being able to translate for your colleagues while they're on a business trip in China. If you can speak the Chinese, and even if you're not that great, if you're just like an okay speaker, you'll find it's okay. It'll be a great bonus for you.
So now please share with us an embarrassing or a funny moment while you were learning Chinese.
Embarrassing or funny moment? Oh my goodness. Loads. I mean, I remember once when I was trying to, I was on television, the first time I appeared on TV, and I only had one line of dialogue, and it was, 我是董默涵. It was a skit. So basically I had to introduce myself, and the joke was, I will be your tube valve. Like using a metaphor. It was like a kind of a dating game show. And the idea was I would say, I'll be your tube valve. So whenever you feel under pressure, you can just, find me and I'll let you release the pressure. 就是中文是那个我是你的气门芯儿，你找我，我给你放气儿了。然后呢，到我这儿呢, the presenter said to me, and what about contestant number 2? I was contestant number 2. What do you have to say? And I said, 我叫董默涵. And that was it. I couldn't remember the second line. So I had 2 lines. One of them was my name, and I remember that. So at least it wasn't that embarrassing. I didn't even know who I was. So I said my name, and then there was silence. And this was a live TV program. So the teacher, Mr. Ding Wanquan,
right,
he was my Chinese teacher, and also he was teaching me crosstalk, like Chinese comedy. He said, 你看这个孩子一看到美女就是不知所措。好，我们看下一位。And just like that, he just said, this guy, as soon as he sees a beauty, he forgets where he is. Let's ask the next person. And just like that went over. So I thought, I have ruined my television career. I'll never be in front of an audience again. And then afterwards, I was really sad. And I said, Mr. Ding, I'm so sorry. I messed up. Please let me back on TV. And he said, yeah, of course. Just don't tell anybody you've forgotten the words. You don't need to say that out loud. Yeah. So there's a tip for you. If you're ever embarrassed, just keep smiling. Don't tell anybody.
That's a funny one. So you're supposed to say like you're the air valve, but then you forgot that line.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, that was just my experience. There's lots of stories where people get the wrong pronunciation, can't be understood, or 什么那个睡觉啊什么的这些. There's loads of these kind of double entendres because of the pronunciation. I mean, Mandarin, the standard Chinese dialect, it's a musical language. It's got notes, it's got tone, and if you get the tones wrong, you're saying a completely different word. I'm sure most of your listeners will be aware of the basics of Chinese pronunciation. Ma. And if you get that wrong, you're saying a completely different word, but in your mind, you're convinced you're saying the right word. It's everybody else who's an idiot who can't understand you. And then you realize, no, actually, I'm saying horse when I want to say my mother. So, you just kind of like, you learn from your mistakes, I suppose. You have to be quite thick-skinned because, as I mentioned before, Chinese people do tend to laugh when they get embarrassed. And they also tend to laugh when they're embarrassed for other people, namely learners of Chinese. So you kind of don't take that too personally and just laugh it off. And that way you'll remember, actually. You'll go to yourself, oh, yeah, that's kind of dumb. Yeah, now I know why I made a mistake. And then just, move on. And, until the next challenge.
So now, please share with us a success story, a most rewarding moment after you have become fluent in Chinese.
A rewarding moment. I thought one of the big things for me was being able to speak Chinese on stage in Ireland. Actually, that was a rewarding moment. For the last few years, I've been asked by UCD, which is University College Dublin here in Dublin, to host the Spring Festival show with a colleague. And it's been very nice being able to stand on the stage in my home country, hometown, and introduce people from China in Chinese.
Nice.
So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Using Chinese outside of China was an interesting thing. Working in TV, I've worked in TV and radio for many years, and opportunities that came as a result of learning Chinese have always been good. Yeah, so I suppose those would be among the highlights, really. Being able to do that and just being confident using Chinese for travel, for business, and meeting people from China and other Chinese learners too. That's always been good as well. And, when asked, helping people with some Chinese learning. So that's always good as well. And also this experience of learning Chinese, I think, has helped me become a better teacher of English. I can understand from the other side,
yes,
what it's like to learn the language, because it can be tough.
Yes.
There's no getting around that. But it doesn't have to be painful, I suppose. That's the message I got. It doesn't have to be painful.
What are you doing with your Chinese now?
Well, I work still with a lot of Chinese companies. I work remotely from Dublin. I also travel to China a few times a year. I'm actually back again in Beijing in November, and I work with a company called Youxuepai. Youxuepai are basically a children's educational company stroke platform, and I'm responsible for writing lesson content and also as a language advisor. So I would be using Chinese for both the hosting of the shows, which are sold on their platform, and also for writing and translating purposes too. So I'm still using Chinese today.
Cool. How would you compare your life before you've learned Chinese and your life after you've learned Chinese?
Well, I mean, obviously Chinese has given me many opportunities. Having traveled around China, that's all because of Chinese. So it's had a massive impact on my life. And as I said already, I travel back and forth to China many times a year. So, it's changed the way I work. And it's made me appreciate things a bit better and appreciate working from home and traveling. And it also made me appreciate clean weather because, well, as you know, weather in Melbourne is beautiful.
Yes.
If you've traveled back recently, it's not quite the same. There's a lot of problems with pollution, so it's made me appreciate that.
Yes.
But I think that overall, though, it's helped me learn a lot about myself and, in terms of business skills, networking, meeting new people, making connections with companies and individuals, all through the language. So it's been very good.
Yeah, definitely a lot of things you experience will definitely give you a new layer to life.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so please share with us one special thing about the Chinese culture that is different to your own culture.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, there's so many different things. The biggest difference, I guess, would be, well, in terms of Beijing, for example, where I spent most of my time, the amount of people in the city is quite different from Ireland. It's very crowded, a bit imposing after a while, and it makes it a little bit uncomfortable. But that's just one aspect of the city. Another thing about Chinese society in terms of the way people interact, Chinese people tend to be, there's less of an emphasis on kind of personal space. That could be due to the lack of personal space simply because there's so many people. Right. So that's a little bit difficult, I think, for a lot of people from Ireland to deal with because, personal space is an important thing. If you get too close to somebody, I mean, that's where we get the expression in one's face. You're literally standing too close. That can be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit intimidating. But in China, you don't have that option. Not all the time. I mean, obviously you have remoter places, but sometimes it can be quite tricky. So that's one thing. Also, kind of like Chinese people sometimes can be very direct, more so than in Ireland. So they might ask you questions that you could consider rather personal about your relationship status or your financial status.
Right.
So all of these things are not necessarily taboo, but you wouldn't go to somebody and say, so listen, how much money are you actually earning every year after tax? Like, oh, cool. I was just going to ask you, did you want another Coke? But now we're talking about this. So, that's obviously something else that's tricky. But it's just one of those things you kind of like, you learn to laugh it off. I always told myself, well, this is China, so it's different. And I use that as a kind of as a starting off point. I'd say, well, look, don't take it too seriously. They do things differently here, and don't take it too personally. And then I'd use that as a kind of a cover, if you like, for not getting too worried about things. So, yeah, it worked out okay for me. Yeah, so I mean, obviously there are other differences too, but for me, those would be the main ones.
Mm. What's your favorite city in China?
Favorite city? That's a tricky one. Depends where this has been broadcast, because if you say one city, then people say, "Oh, I thought you liked that city." Well, obviously Beijing. I've been there for the longest, so that would be probably up there. But it's funny actually saying that you like Beijing. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a beautiful city, because it has the most pollution of any of the cities I've been to. It's quite serious, but there are more opportunities there. I don't know. I love Chengdu in Sichuan.
Right.
That's a nice city. It's relatively small for Chinese standards, and it's also quite manageable. It's a flat city, so it's really nice too. And other cities, I like Hangzhou as well. Suzhou, beautiful too, and Shanghai as well. Shanghai is a very cosmopolitan place.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So you've definitely been to many places.
Yeah, I've traveled around quite a bit, which was great.
Cool. Is there a tool, an app, or a website that you cannot live without in learning Chinese?
Well, I suppose any dictionary app is quite useful. I didn't really have any tools apart from a physical dictionary, printed dictionary, when I was learning. But now there's loads of apps and podcasts and stuff like that you can use. I would suggest use them all. Basically, don't have to just use one. I mean, there's Youdao. That's a good app actually.
Right.
Youdao. It's in English. Well, I think it's more for Chinese students learning English, but obviously
That's
as
true.
a dictionary, you can use it for learning Chinese too, and it gives you the pronunciation, and there's a recording as well.
Yes.
So that's a good one. And because it's like on your phone, you can just jump into it any time. I use that quite a bit actually, if I'm not sure of a character or the pronunciation, or even just to kind of just read the news. There's a few kind of like most news portals have their own app as well, which is good for more advanced learners. It's good to read every day, even if it's just for 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
In Chinese, obviously. That's a good thing. So, whatever kind of news you're into, I would suggest trying to be quite broad with your reading habits, like, sport, finance, politics, local and international news. It's good to know how to talk about the news internationally in Chinese. That would be more for an intermediate, advanced learner. Because you learn a whole new set of vocabulary and phrases, and staying abreast of what's happening in China is also very useful as well. If you want to make conversation with somebody asks you your opinion about what's happening in China. Mind you, for obvious reasons, people don't talk politics about China unless they're outside of the country. It's unlike Ireland as well, where the average Joe would have an opinion about everything that a politician has done, whereas in China you don't really hear about people talking about politicians. You would hear people talking about like the arts, or pollution, or jobs and family, that kind of thing, all that kind of stuff. That's why it's good to read the newspaper and news apps.
Is there a particular app you use?
There isn't one particular one I use. As I mentioned, Youdao is one I've been using quite recently. There's also Huaren Toutiao, which is a good one,
right?
Which is like overseas Chinese, like headline news, I guess it would be translated as. I mean, it's just one of many apps. It's quite good, and and then of course you've got the Sina.
Yes.
Sina, which is like a massive portal to China, and it's probably one of the largest websites in the world. So that's also very good for learners, again, more intermediate, advanced learners. But it's really good. That's a good one because you can put it on your phone and just when you're waiting in traffic, or if you got a few minutes to kill, you can use that to kind of pick up some Chinese. To stay abreast of world politics, world events, I should say.
Yes. Cool. So if you are to recommend our listeners only one book in learning Chinese or the Chinese culture, what would that be?
Wow, that's a tough one. It's really difficult. I mean, because China is such a massive, it's really hard to get your head around just how big China is, and the recorded history, over thousands of years. It's difficult to find one book that I would say this is the book to go to if you want to know everything China. And I tell you, one practical book which I would recommend would be The Lonely Planet, whatever the latest Lonely Planet, because in the index there are kind of simplified and shortened, abridged versions of Chinese history. And it's a good way, especially if you're planning on traveling to China, to get a crash course in what's it all about. And then from that, you can probably find some other books more specific to the region that you're in or to a certain period in Chinese history that you're in. Because otherwise, if you start looking up like a concise history of Chinese history, you're looking at books well over 1,000 pages, and it's like, oh God, you're never going to wrap your head around it. So I'd say The Lonely Planet's a good one to start with, and then from that, it's like a bite-sized, condensed version of Chinese history. And then from there, you can go and take a look at different authors. And I mean, I've read several books about Chinese history. Wild Swans is a very good one for a very interesting period of Chinese history. Yep. By the same author, the Mao book, which is a very dense text. And while it's obviously about the leader of China, Chairman Mao, it also goes into the history of China, before and after Mao as well. There are also many other good, From Emperor to Citizen. That's a classic, about the last emperor of China, which is a very interesting book. That's actually published in China by the Foreign Language Press. Speaking of which, if you do get to Beijing, I would highly recommend the Foreign Language Bookshop, which is in Wangfujing. It's like the kind of the big shopping district in Beijing. It's a very good bookshop, and it also has its own publication house. And the books are a little bit out of date, to be honest. I mean, this particular book, it's talking about a period just prior to basically what we refer to now as modern China, the People's Republic of China. But it's a very interesting period of Chinese history because it is the last emperor. And you can actually see photographs and there's video of the Emperor of China abdicating. And it's a transitional period in Chinese history, a lot happening during that time. And this book was written by the man himself and about his transformation from emperor to an ordinary guy.
Oh, really? It was written by himself?
Yeah, it's written by the actual emperor himself. Now, obviously, it was printed in the 50s and 60s. So China then is quite different, or was quite different, I should say, to the way China is now. So I would take everything he says with a large pinch of salt. Yeah. But it's still interesting as a historical artifact to get some kind of a background. What was it like during that time? Just your Red Star over China. Is that Edward Snow? Is that his name, Mr. Snow? He was like a foreign doctor or a journalist who was on the Great March, or the Long March in the 50s in China. That was before the Cultural Revolution. So, these are all periods of history that I'm particularly interested in. I mean, these are just my own selections, but yeah, I'd say I'd stick with the Lonely Planet, though, to give you a kind of a guide, literally a guide to China and to Chinese history. And then from there, you'll probably become fascinated with, because there's so many interesting historical figures. Empress Dowager, one of the most ruthless and powerful emperors, the only female emperor ever in Chinese history. Yep. And her story is very interesting indeed. So, there's so much going on in Chinese history. It's a lot to take in on the first go around, so that's why I would stick with a simplified version, and then from that you kind of take your time and discover it for yourself. There are extensive libraries all about Chinese history and politics, which is quite interesting as well. And then of course you've got the more modern publications about Chinese economics and the influence of the current president, Xi Jinping. He's a very popular president in China, and he's considered to be one of the most influential leaders in Asia. So it's an interesting time. And of course, right in the middle now of the two great meetings in Beijing, which is happening as we speak. So he is the man of the moment. So it's good to read about him, find out what plans he has for the country.
Wow. Some really good recommendations on the books. So now, this is your opportunity to teach our listeners your favorite Chinese quote, phrase, or expression.
Okay, I'll teach you one that I learned the hard way. 囊中羞涩.
Right.
囊中羞涩 it would be like a phrase in Chinese which basically means to have no money, to have an empty wallet. And the reason I picked that one is because when I was learning Chinese crosstalk the first time, that was one of the first difficult phrases we had to learn. Myself and a guy from Benin called Molisi, and Benin in West Africa, and we had to learn this crosstalk. And I had loads of these kind of expressions, and I just could not remember it. The only way I could try to remember it was to use it in everyday conversation, but it's not something you can use because it's a very formal, antiquated expression.
Right.
So we would just use that in conversation, say, 今天你请客，为什么呢？我囊中羞涩，下次我请吧。So, say like, I don't have any cash, you treat me. But in Chinese, it kind of sounds a bit weird. Like, it's very outdated. It's like saying, I don't have a penny to my name. As antiquated as that might sound. So that was like one way of actually using Chinese for your own methods, your own needs, basically, by just putting it into conversation, even when it didn't actually suit.
Yeah.
So that expression has stuck with me since 1999, actually, when I first learned it. And even though it's a very old expression, an antiquated expression, it's one that I think I'll never forget.
Cool. That's very interesting because one of our previous guests actually shared this phrase or expression, which is 囊中羞涩. It's very interesting. So literally it means embarrassing in your pocket, isn't it?
Yeah. It's like saying, because you can imagine like in a cartoon when the guy opens a wallet and flies come out of it.
Yeah.
Because there's no money in there.
So now our audience definitely have to learn this phrase now because two of our guests have shared this phrase. Definitely means some significance.
Right.
So
good.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's not a very common phrase in a Chinese conversation.
Right.
But if you're able to use this word in your daily conversation, it's pretty impressive.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, cool. So if you were to give our listeners one single piece of parting advice in learning Chinese, what would that be?
I would say to you, enjoy the process of learning the language. And by that, what I mean is, don't be disheartened when things get tough. Chinese is a tough language, there's no doubt about it, but it's not the most difficult language to learn. And the reason why it's not the most difficult language to learn is because what you end up saying in Chinese is not that much different to what you would say in your mother tongue. So remind yourself that all you're trying to do is communicate. Focus more on the message rather than the method. Give yourself a pat on the back now and again when you actually speak fluent enough to be understood by others. Listen as best you can to other people. Always ask for help. Never be afraid to say, I don't know. The expression in Chinese is 就是那个不懂装懂. It's like pretending you understand.
Yep.
So, just say 就装不懂啊. So even if you understand what the person is saying, say, 什么意思啊? What does that mean? And then get them to explain it and go, 对对对，跟我想的差不多. And also using humor to justify why you're an idiot after learning Chinese for so long, just like, so for example, if somebody is trying to make you feel bad because you don't understand something, when they have finished explaining to you the meaning of a word or phrase, you can just say to them, 你是那样理解. Oh, so that's what you think it means. 很有意思. And then they'll go, what do you mean? That's what it means. And all you need to say is, 好，就这么理解吧。就这样。然后呢，看他怎么想的. So that way you kind of, even though basically they've told you what it means, you can pretend that it has a different meaning, but you don't want to tell them that.
Right.
That drives people crazy. Because then they think, 难道还有别的意思吗? And you go, 没关系，就这么理解就行了。好，小朋友. So, that's all. That's it, really. Just enjoy it, basically. It's so much easier now learning Chinese than before. And I'm sure, people who were in China before I will tell you, it was so difficult back in the 70s and 80s. I arrived in China at the end of the 90s, and it was, I won't say it was impossible, but it was tricky.
Yeah.
But now, since, of course, the internet, the way it is at the moment, it's just so much easier. There's so many resources available, both inside and outside of China. So just use all of the resources available. Remind yourself that it's a process. And don't set your expectations too high. Enjoy the process and just ask questions. Always ask questions. That's the best thing. And don't get too hung up on grammar either, because grammar is not your friend. 语法不是你的好朋友. So don't worry about the grammar.
Yeah, some great advices. So, just before we let you go, Richard, how can our listeners reach you?
Yeah. Okay. Well, do you want my home address? Well, you can contact me on Skype if you want, if you have any questions. I think you have my Skype details. Or on Facebook, my Irish name. Hang on, I'll tell you what, I'll make it easier. One other tool I should mention for learning Chinese language is using Chinese social media. So probably the two biggest platforms would be WeChat and Weibo. So WeChat is basically like WhatsApp. So on WeChat, you can add me, FASTSON 2012. 就是微信是这个 FASTSON 2012 or on Weibo, which is like I suppose Twitter, kind of.
Yes.
The name is 爱尔兰的董默涵.
Right.
That's my handle, if you like,
Sure.
on Weibo. Oh yeah, so if you've got any questions, drop me a note and I will ask my secretary to block you. No, I'll answer.
Yeah, I'll link all the resources we mentioned in our show note.
Great.
So awesome. Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing today with our listeners
No worries.
your journey in learning Chinese. It's been very beneficial to us.
Cool. I'm glad I could help.
To our listeners, the show note is now available at ChineseTalkEase.com/20. TalkEase is spelled as TALKEZE. Do you want to learn Chinese for free? Start your own journey to Chinese fluency with my video lessons at ChineseTalkEase.com. TalkEase is spelled as TALKEZE. Also remember to join our Facebook group. Just head over to TalkChineseCommunity.com. If you have enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. Each month, I will choose one reviewer and give out a 1-year subscription to all my premium video lessons for free. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next episode.